We have fabulous panel here today, and they have fabulous bios which you can read. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves so we can find out that their vocal cords are working. And actually give us your title, your name, rank, and serial number, and we'll start from there.
How government-like. My name is Dr. Richard Pazdur, and I'm the director of the Office of Hematology Oncology Products in Cedar in the FDA.
I'm David Parkinson. I have a background in clinical oncology. I've had a career in both academic oncology, but then in drug development at the National Cancer Institute, Amgen, Novartis, Biogen Idec. Spent the last 5 years developing building a molecular diagnostics company in the Bay Area, and I've just transitioned into NEA, which is a large venture firm. So I've seen all of this from different directions.
Dr. Klein. Right now I'm the Chief of Staff to the Chief Medical Officer at Aetna and working on oncology strategy, and started out in academics for about 8 years. Did some work with Medicare demonstration project on the frail elderly, did some hospital administration, and right now trying to help along with Dr. Newcomer and the others in the private payer space to help us find a better place and a better way to deliver oncology care.
I'm John Castellani. I'm President and Chief Executive Officer of Pharma.
And I'm Ken Anderson. I'm a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and I've been privileged for over 30 years, I guess, to do translational research in blood cancers, and in particular multiple myeloma, and sort of watch the landscape and the treatment paradigm, and most importantly, patient outcome really be transformed.
So I asked myself, sitting there today, if I had this panel and all the resources in the world, and I wanted to change the course of cancer through innovative approaches, are these the guys I would pick? Fortunately, you all passed the test, so you're here. So I want to just set the stage for where we are, and I think where our conversation has taken us today. The way I heard this morning and this afternoon, all fabulous talks, by the way, and the panels were fabulous. I think the way we have to think about this is we have this whole area of science and discovery, which sits out there supported both by the government and the private sector. And I should point out that since that fateful day in 1971, December 23rd, when we signed the National Cancer Act, we've invested about roughly $113 billion through the NCI in cancer. You can probably double or triple that when you consider the amount of money coming from the private sector into this field. So it's a pretty highly resourced activity. On top of that, we have thousands of investigators working in this field. This is probably the largest group of investigators ever to investigate a disease in the history of our world. The other thing that you have to think about, however, when you put that on one side of the equation, is the other side of the equation is this is a disease that will take about 560,000 lives this year, unheard of, about 1.4 million new cases diagnosed. And if you look at 25 to 30 years, ACS will tell you that this is likely to double, probably minimally 30%, maybe double, at a cost this year of about $264 billion. And if you look at that globally, it's somewhere in the $800 to $900 billion arena as of today. And the international burden of cancer is going to sweep out everything we've ever seen with any disease. So this is a huge issue. It is so big that I think we want as a community to really deal with the size of the problem. And so when you look at the complexity, we are always overwhelmed by the complexity. So what strikes me is this community has to embrace complexity. The disease is complex. The system is complex. Everything about this is complex. We can all agree on that. But that's no excuse. We need to do something specific, I think, in each of these areas. So if you take the science, there are things we can do. Science then turns into a translatable activity where I think we have real deficiencies. Then it goes over to our friend Dr. Pazdur for regulatory review, and he gets blamed for virtually everything. Commercialization is going on, obviously, in parallel. That's how you get to regulatory review. And then the payers sit somewhere at the end of this whole continuum. And other than FDA, they are now the most maligned of the group sitting up here. Well, maybe pharma as well. So we have groups. We represent the promise, but we also represent the problem. So I want to start with a question, and it's a very simple question, but you have to remember your own answer. So I want you to tell me, starting with Rick, what do you think the major barrier to realizing all that we've talked about this morning, which is personalized medicine, based on the idea that we have a genomic alteration in patients? As you heard from lots of people this morning, this is a very complex scenario. It's not a simple issue that we're going to find a lot of simple genomic changes. But what do you think the major barrier to realizing personalized cancer medicine is?
The answer to that, I'll give you 5. 1, a greater understanding of the disease. 2, a greater understanding of the disease. 3, a greater understanding of the disease. 4, the greater understanding of the disease. And 5, a greater understanding of the disease.
That would have been my answer, so I agree with you 100%. So,
and I think we're seeing that. You know, there is a degree of pessimism here, and I sat back and listened to Dr. McClellan's talk, and he did have some of the exact numbers, more current numbers. If you take a look at 2011, calendar year 2011, 1/3 of the new molecular entities approved by the FDA was in the area of oncology.
Right.
If you take a look at calendar year 2012, this year, we will have greater than 20 applications for new molecular entities representing a variety of diseases. So this disease that we call cancer does have a significant degree of activity. Here again, I think the major issue, and the reason why I'm emphasizing a greater understanding of the disease, that avails us to drugs that have greater efficacy. Our job as drug regulators is intensely more facile if we have a drug that clearly works. Where we get into problems with this risk-benefit decision is in areas where there's a marginal effect. Oncology is different from other therapeutic areas in the FDA. Our major issue is efficacy. It is not toxicity that has plagued the other therapeutic areas with Vioxx, et cetera. Our major issue is the demonstration of efficacy. And when we can define a population that has greater efficacy, everybody's job is easier. It's irrespective of what endpoint one uses, what type of approval one uses, et cetera. It is much easier to approve a drug.
Okay, so not having a clear understanding of the disease. We're going to come back to that because there are things we can do about that, and there are things that we must do about that. David, what's your take on this? What would you say is the major barrier from your perspective?
Well, I'm a person who votes with my energies and activities, and about 5 years ago, I decided that the reason I left clinical medicine was I was frustrated with the inadequacies of the therapies. The reason I went into drug development, and I was very successful in that area, was because I believed that one could develop new drugs more efficiently than the industry was doing it. I came to the conclusion that the lack of productivity in the industry, which is well recognized and self-recognized, was not due to the industry's ability to generate molecules. The industry can do that. It's done it for 100 years plus. The issue, rather, was the inefficiencies in linking those targeted drugs with patients who were not characterized in a biologically appropriate manner. So, okay, no problem. One moves over into the world of molecular diagnostics like a naif. So I've spent the last 5 years as CEO of a startup in that area, and I can tell you the promise is all there. The technologies exist. They can efficiently link patients with therapeutic strategies. They give the promise of making Dr. Pazdur's life easier, which is, of course, my goal in life, and has been for these many years.
You want to wash my car?
I feel like I've done it for a long time. But to answer your question specifically, there is no business model for everything we've talked about here today. That is developing regulatory quality, highly predictive clinical tests that accurately link biologically targeted therapeutics with patients appropriately categorized. There is no current business model. And it is no small irony to me that I sit between two maligned areas, self-admitted. No, on the left are the regulators who have come to the understanding of the value of personalized medicine and appropriately are saying, listen, if these tests are going to guide the use of therapeutics, we are going to regulate this area. All of a sudden, the diagnostics industry for the first time, and I really mean that, is now charged with developing high levels of evidence around its diagnostic tests, in many respects parallel to, or at least as complex as, developing the therapeutics. And trust me, I've done both. Okay. To the right, though, is the disconnect, because the payers, as exemplified not by the private payers so much, because they tend to follow Medicare policy, but at least at the Medicare level, you are basically, if you can get approval, which takes a long time, you are recompensed at time and materials. So the disconnect between the recognized value and the requirement for developing levels of evidence, and then basically being paid for time and materials at the other end, not being recognized in any sort of efficient way, short of many years of struggling with reimbursement, results in a lack of a business model, and the reason is the reason for which all these newly started molecular diagnostic companies are struggling right now. So, you know, it's one thing for us to talk about the promise, and one thing for us to talk about the technology. These are all true, and nobody believes it more strongly than I do. But you know, where the rubber meets the road is who's going to pay for the development of these tests. It is not going to be the venture world. That's quite clear. Too short term, too little money for the changing expectations in this field.
Well, maybe IRA will pay.
Well, I've asked for volunteers. Haven't seen a long line. But we all benefit from all of this, but it's not so clear where the ownership is in the development of regulated tests that actually change the practice of medicine. And I was just talking to Mark McClellan. I sat through a meeting in Stockholm last year. Pay for performance, where you only get, as a company, reimbursed for drugs that work, changes all the current alignments, changes pharmaceutical companies from selling products to selling services, and is probably the best justification there ever could be for the development of personalized medicine and clinical quality regulated tests, not publication quality, clinical quality regulated tests.
Okay,
so,
Ira, let's move on to you. From your standpoint, what do you think the major barrier to achieving a future of personalized medicine is in some reasonable period of time?
Well, I think that Rick and David both made excellent points about what's going on in drug development, drug approval, finding the right patient for the right drug, and then making sure that the companion diagnostic test is the appropriate test for the appropriate patient, and then understanding what the business case would be to support those companion diagnostic tests coming out so that you can have the proper match. On my side, I look at this as two areas of focus. One is regulatory and legislative, which is really their area. My area is really more concerned with payment models that align incentives once the drugs and the companion diagnostic tests are delivered in terms of approval. Not a lot may be known about them because these drugs have just come out of phase 3 trials. We don't have phase 4 post-market surveillance. We think they work. We think the companion diagnostic tests match up well. We're not sure. And so what I think the private payer space can do is innovate in the pay-for-value world, where when you have practicing oncologists who range anywhere from 1- and 2-person offices to large groups that are either multi-specialty and fully integrated, or an oncology practice that's owned by a hospital system, what those people need are tools to allow them to actually do the right thing at the right time for the right patient. And today, we don't really see those tools out in that space to any great degree. There's some pockets of innovation, but there's really not throughout the country the ability to go to any oncologist's office and say, can you please show me your clinical decision support tool? Can you show me how it works? can you show me how it takes the latest therapy, the NCCN guidelines, and tells you what to do for a particular patient who may have a breast cancer subtype or a colon cancer subtype that requires some kind of biologic testing, and how you factor that genetic marker into your therapy, and tell me who are you contracted with for payment, and what does that payment look like? Does it return value to you if you manage to coach your patient on what to do to avoid hospitalizations, if you give the right antiemetic therapy, if you use the proper colony stimulating factors at the appropriate time for the appropriate patient. So you don't see that out there. And those are the kind of things that the private payer can do so that, in the end, patients who are deserving of personalized therapy can actually go into any office. They don't have to go into some academic temple of medicine. They can go to the person who's an oncologist down the street and get up-to-date therapy that's personalized, and who's ever paying for that therapy is assured that that patient is getting the most up-to-date and appropriate therapy, and that provider, instead of being incented to fill all of their infusion chairs, and anyone who calls and says, I'm feeling crappy, send them to the ER, that person has a chance to come back to the office, get coached, avoid a hospitalization, and essentially get the best care possible. So I think that's where we have an opportunity, and we are doing that right now through the use of software vendors who have clinical decision support that bolts into the existing practice EMRs. We're very sensitive to the fact that as oncologists have lost revenue when CMS moved from an AWP to an ASP type of model, that they're not willing to do one more thing in the office because they've already tried to defend their revenue that they lost from the change in drug reimbursement to ramping themselves up to be over 100% capacity. So what we're doing is making sure that anything we offer actually simplifies their office practice management, simplifies their workflow, so that when they're with a patient, they're not thinking about, oh, well, what regimen do I want to give? Oh, what did that person say? It's all there, several touches on a touch screen, and they can spend more face time with the patient. And personalized medicine is actually also about the doctor talking to the patient. And if we can create more time and space for that and incent the doctor to do it financially as well, we think that'll happen and hopefully answer at least part of your question.
So, John, from your perspective.
Well, before we have a spike in the prescribing of antidepressant drugs here.
And we haven't even gotten to Ken yet, so.
Yeah, let me point out some good news first and foremost. I mean, last week we issued a report that said there are more than 1,000 medicines that are in the discovery process right now for cancer. So the field remains robust, even though it has a lot of challenges. It is very complex, and it is made even more complex, as the paper that was released this morning shows, by the very incremental nature of the science that we're dealing with. There is a fundamental mismatch with that incremental nature and the time frame and focus of the public policy process. So if you look at the four things that are necessary to sustain innovation in this area particularly, you need an up-to-date, robust, expeditious, and clear and transparent and regulatory system. And surprisingly enough, we're making progress in getting one. I mean, I don't think anybody would have predicted that the UFAs came out by voice vote in the House and with only one disagreement, one nay vote in the Senate. We need a vibrant scientific ecosystem that is up to date and obviously reflects the latest in science and how the science is evolving. As Mark talked about, as several people talked about, there is a changing, very rapidly changing research model in the pharmaceutical sector. We need a business environment that attracts capital, and that is a real concern, particularly in the small biotech sector right now. But probably the biggest issue, to answer your question, is we need a better match between the time horizon and perspective of the policies that value medicines, and particularly in this area, and the science and therapeutic value of the medicines themselves. Because if we are stuck, as we are in a fiscal process, which Mark McClellan described, that looks at value over 12-month increments, then we will never capture the value of avoiding much more costly acute care. We will never capture the value of a longer and productive life, particularly if we insist that it come in very large chunks of time when the discovery occurs. So the biggest challenge is the mismatch of that time perspective of the public policy maker and the time perspective of the clinician and the science.
So we'll come back to that. I think there may not be uniform agreement with that. So, Ken?
Yeah, I remain irrepressibly optimistic as a Celtics fan and a Red Sox fan, which is not that easy at the present time. But I think you asked earlier, Ann, whether you thought this team that was up here was a winning team. And I would sort of extend the team to the people in this room. But I do think we are the winning team. We have to figure out why we're here. And I think we heard in the panels this morning beautifully, and then Sid Mukherjee was off the charts. But it's about the patient. And personalized medicine, which is why we're here, is to make science count for patients. Diagnosis, prognosis, treatment. And number two, personalized means you treat patients as you would want to be treated yourself. That's why we're all here. And I like to talk, as Ann knows only too well, about teams. So team science is a very fashionable term these days. But to me, the team that is necessary to deliver on the goal of personalized medicine is made up of academia. It's represented here and in this room very well. Academia, biotech, pharma, funders, National Cancer Institute, and others, regulators, and most importantly, the patients. And I'll just mention very quickly, in each of the areas, we need to be better able to collaborate and interact and take advantage of what position we play on the team on behalf of improving things for the patient. So let me just mention in the science area, so I'm one of those, I'm in the temple of academia, is that what you said? Wow. Anyway, I'm just...
You're thrilled now, right?
I feel taller, Ann, really, yeah. But in any event, but what we do is we study science and we identify targets, and we can validate targets as important in cancer, and we can help validate targeted therapies. And we have models of cancer. But what's important, and hasn't really been stressed that much here today, we're talking about all the genomic complexity, which is huge. But we haven't really talked about the context yet. The same mutation in melanoma is not at all the same in colon cancer because they're different phenotypes. So we in academia have the models of the tumor in the microenvironment. So we need to appreciate better the complexity, as you mentioned, and we need, our role is to identify not only the one target that might be essential, but the 2 or 3 others, or many others, which are accessory pathways that either already exist or are going to evolve and predicted to evolve, so that there's going to need to be, right from the outset, combinations of therapies very early before the chaos that already exists is allowed to progress even further in patients' relapse. So the implication is strong for academia. For the interaction with pharma, there needs to be the ability now for the scientific discoveries to more readily translate. So what I mean by that is the interactions between pharma and academia, for example, are getting much more complex. Conflict of interest doesn't even allow, I don't know who can buy who a cup of coffee anymore.
Neither of us can.
But we probably can't have coffee, truthfully. But the point is, if we don't interact with our biotech and pharma colleagues, none of this, the potential new discoveries are going to move to the bedside for diagnosis, prognosis, or treatment, or the biomarker that David's talking about. And then when you get to the level of the National Cancer Institute, which we love, and I'm blessed to have been funded for a long time, but you know, they're funding 7% of the grants that are sent in. So I think we might agree in this room that cancer might be a bigger problem than that seems to indicate as a priority. And so we need to be creative around different mechanisms of funding translational research, whether it be the foundations that you heard about this morning, or philanthropy, or other models that could, with the pre-competitive consortium, et cetera, but new models whereby we might fund this endeavor that better couples academia, biotech, and pharma with the funding agencies. And I just want to put in a plea or a plug for American Association of Cancer Research, who together with Rick and his colleagues are really championing the cause of what we call regulatory science. Because as the advances are occurring in the biology of cancer, so it is that we need to have new models, and we need to understand what are the right clinical trials, what's the right endpoint, how can you test two brand new drugs, neither of which is approved together, predicated upon preclinical science that is really strong, that you don't have to go with each agent along their pathway for 7 to 10 years, but combine it. These kinds of things by Janet and Rick and colleagues are hugely positive in terms of ability to move things more quickly. And then in terms of having gone from a bench to the bedside, as I say, and let's say that we actually win, where I don't think I should say that from Boston, but let's say we're on a winning team, how are we going to make sure that patients have access to these medicines? And I'll tell you one thing that I've been involved with, honestly, since it started is this NCCN, which Ann knows well, but National Comprehensive Cancer Center Network. And you know, it's algorithms for how to potentially at least have options for therapy of patients at different levels or stages of their disease. And in fact, it's hugely positive. In the start, I must admit, I was very skeptical. CMS adopted these guidelines for reimbursement. Many of the big payers in the United States have. They're being adopted, as I call it, intergalactically all over the world, in terms of two things, sort of establishing a framework for the treatment of cancer, but also education and awareness of caregivers and patients alike. So what I'm getting at, it's a long answer, but I think it's a team and that starts and includes all of those different constituencies. But if we remember what's the game we're trying to win, it's for the patient. We need to be judged on whether we improve the outcome of patients or not.
All right, so we've heard from these experts. Let me just see if I can recap. Rick says basically it's all about the science. We don't really understand enough, and I couldn't agree more. I think if you look at the ACR progress report from last year, it sort of says that we're kind of at the end of the beginning. If you think about genomics and you think of where we are, you know, I can sequence Ken's genome. That's a lot of terabytes to look at, but there are going to be communities that look at the genome, some that look at the epigenome, some that look at the proteome, the transcriptome, the personome. I mean, you know, we're there. It's every ohm you can imagine, and those interactions and those functions are still pretty obscure to us, frankly. And let me just go back one more step and tell you that if I'm thinking about basic biological discovery today, we don't have any national policies for standardizing our biospecimens. We don't have standards for our technologies. We don't have standards, nor do we have a language to capture the function of these changes. This is not a trivial, none of these are trivial problems, but it gets to Rick's point, I think, that you know, you can't throw things over the wall and expect, in clinical trials, and expect them to always succeed if, in fact, you really didn't understand the interrogation of the tissues or the patient samples that you were talking about in the first place. And it may look pretty good in a small sample set. May not look so good when you get to phase 3. So let's come back to that in just a second, because there are things that I think we can do from a policy perspective. David hit it on just right out of the ballpark in terms of molecular diagnostics. The field is pretty moribund. We haven't invested in it. We don't have, I mean, CDRH at FDA is overwhelmed with the number of possible things that could be important in assigning patients to trials, et cetera, and new diagnostics. But we really haven't formulated clear strategies for this, and it's not an encouraging field for people to invest their money in. So there isn't a business model. I love the comment from our favorite payer up here, who basically said we need decision tools so that physicians can actually use this stuff. Well, who's working on that? Not very many people, and not doing it very well, I think, yet, because we haven't done what Ken said, is to put these teams together to define what that should be. And then actually, we got an optimistic view from pharma, which I thought was absolutely on the money. We have a lot of drugs in development. Many of them will fail, but a lot of drugs are in development right now based on this genomic revolution mostly. And he also made some, I think, really excellent points about the fact that we do have a lot of people now supporting, for example, legislation around improvement of FDA policies and processes, which I think is regulatory science is driving. I mean, it's one thing to beat up the agency all the time. It's something else to try to work on the problems. Ken, I thought, made the greatest point, and that is getting information is not the end of the world. I mean, we're going to get more data than we ever could have dreamed at. That does put us at an inflection point. That is not knowledge. So basically, it takes a team to develop knowledge, and we are not supporting team science in this country to any great extent, and we are not rewarding it at all. We actually go the other direction. For R01 Science, we reward you not to share your data, publish your data, hold it for 6 months, possibly a year, maybe 2, and in the pharma world, you keep your data because you want it to be secret. You have to develop IP. And in fact, you're dealing with a digital genome where if you have a piece of the information, you have a piece of the information. You don't have all the information. So we are at an inflection point, and I hesitate to ever say that because I've said that in past years and been wrong, but I think we're here. So I think we are at an inflection point. So let me come back, and this is an easy question. Easy question. Yeah. Based on what you said, if you can remember it all, and some of you said a lot of things, so you should have kept it simpler. What would you do from a policy standpoint to obviate or address the barrier that you identified? Simple. Don't get carried away. Just give us a simple declarative approach. I'm not going to start with Rick because he looks like he's thinking very hard over there. So I'm going to start with Ken.
I just think that we need to reward team science. The goal that we all have is to improve patient outcome.
Let me stop you right there. Okay, that is the greatest platitude of all times. How would you do that?
Okay, so there are policies that have to happen in each of the team members that are necessary to reach the goal. So I'll speak from the temple of academia. We have to have reward systems that are in place that reward team science and academia, that reward the translation of our findings towards clinical.
We don't have those, Ken. How do we get those?
We have policies that are coming at Harvard Medical School for new tracks for promoting folks for translational medicine. They're members of a team, and instead of individual. No?
Really?
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
Because in the new projects...
If Harvard can do it, we can all do it.
Well, that may be, yeah. I was going to make a wisecrack, but I will get in such trouble for doing that. No, but I just think we have to reward team science. We have to acknowledge that the complexity demands no one person's laboratory, no one person's research interest is going to be able to get the target, validate the target, et cetera. So within academia, we need to have that as a policy change, that the goal is actually not papers in Cell Science and Nature. It is actually, have you or have you not improved outcome, and that, for me, would mean translational medicine. That's just one example. And there are examples in biotech, pharma, and regulatory, et cetera, where the policies could change. I mean, the policies have changed. Rick and others have changed, I believe, incredible prescient of thought here, combinations of therapies, right? Testing, acknowledging the complexity of biology, and the policies are changing so that, in fact, the paradigm for approving a targeted therapy, crizotinib and others, it's hugely positive. And now acknowledging that, no one drug, even Gleevec or others, are enough usually. You have to combine.
But Kenneth said something really important here, and that is, this is something we can change. We have control over this. Yeah. We can actually change the way we incent investigators. Why we don't do it, I don't know. I mean, I've met with, we've had consortia of university presidents at NIH when I was there come together to talk about this. They all agree. but they don't go home and do it. So a university like yours and maybe mine and other places could begin to set the stage for this, but Congress is always stunned when they find out that we don't have a reward system for this. I mean, so, all right, that's something that I think there are at least many organizations here today who could actually push on this issue. So let's talk now, John, about this issue that you raised in terms of the time span that is being used to judge whether or not innovation should be paid for or not. Basically, that's what we're talking about. So what would you do to change that?
Before I answer that in a very simple way, so at the risk of sounding like Ross Perot, I want to associate myself with what Ken said. But because I think there is a very important point when it comes to collaboration, and it gets to the point I'm going to say. And that is that we need to very clearly define where we should be separated and where we should not collaborate. We have, as an industry, for patient needs and for public needs, a need to have a strong and perceived to be very independent regulator. That is absolutely essential to our industry if the patient is going to trust the safety and effectiveness of the medicines that we develop. On the other hand, we have an obligation for the patients to collaborate so that we can expedite the therapeutic, the discovery process. And right now we have an environment, for a lot of complex reasons, that when we collaborate, we generate a lot of mistrust and skepticism about whether or not that's in the patient's best interest, and that, I agree, has to change because no one can afford it. To get to your specific question, this has been something that we have been grappling with around the world, and you know, we look across the Atlantic and we look at the European systems, and they are utilizing health technology assessment as a model to determine what should be paid for by their systems of payment, which are all, of course, the public payers, the governments. HTA has a flaw that we thought that we could overcome here in the United States by calling it comparative effectiveness research that broadens the time frame. Yet there is no place where I can go and get a degree in comparative effectiveness research.
Nope.
So it is now defined by whoever is describing it at the time they're describing it. That's why, you know, our foundation is funding 2 centers of it, one at Hopkins and one at Washington State, University of Washington and the state of Washington, because we need a science that helps
Yes.
evaluate and a scientific capability to evaluate various therapies over a period of time. That gets to the answer to my question, and that is, we all talk about it. People will say from a political standpoint that so long as anyone who was here in 1974, when Graham-Rudman-Hollings was first passed, is still breathing, we will always do static scoring. But static scoring is what will bankrupt this country because it presumes that there is no benefit in a longer and healthier life. None. It's scored at 0. It presumes that there is no benefit in prevention and wellness. It scores at 0. It presumes that there's no benefit in cure or management because it scores at 0. When from a scientific standpoint, we know that it's possible and that there are benefits. So whether you call it adaptive or dynamic scoring, whether you call it comparative effectiveness research, we have to change the perspective from a fiscal policy standpoint to account for the effects of the application of good science and good clinical practices to patients that could have a benefit to the country as a whole.
So, Rick, have you been thinking over there?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So Rick, is, as you probably know, sits at the nexus of pretty much everything we do in oncology drug development, and he gets a lot of attention. Sometimes good, sometimes not so good, but he takes it all in good humor, I think. And he has been telling us the same thing for as long as I've known him, So what would you do, Rick, to change
Well, the
this?
question that I have, I'll answer your question with a question, and it's a rhetorical question. And
he always does this,
the
by the way.
issue is, who's in charge of this process?
Right.
And, you know, I keep on hearing the issue, well, you know, look at the example of hepatitis C, or look at the AIDS example, or look at some other disease. But really, what we're dealing here is a very complicated process which far exceeds the issues that AIDS has, because we know the etiology of that disease. So we're dealing with a very complex process, and perhaps this question we should be asking, is this whole issue, for lack of a better analogy, more akin to the moon project in a sense, shooting to the moon and having to collaborate and bring multiple people together. And here again, somebody had to be in charge of that.
Right.
It couldn't just be, well, everybody do whatever they want and maybe sometime we'll get to the moon here, okay? And what I see is a difference in potentially objectives. You know, when I entered the field in the 1970s, I was under the impression that all of drug development in oncology would be done by the NCI, and that the pharmaceutical company, I was told this by my mentor, would have no interest in oncology because this disease is tinged by death, so to speak. It's a low profit margin because these drugs are going to be used occasionally. We really don't have a good model to develop these drugs. And what I see from my position is perhaps a different objective that industry has, and I'm sure the overall objective of everyone is to really improve patients' lives, but there also is a financial interest to stakeholders that they have, to their financial holders, and also to reduce risk and to make sure that their projects work in a sense. So many times we take a look, and many of the drugs that we've approved are breakthrough drugs, but some are Me Too drugs too, or minor advances in the disease, where we see a lot of effort and a lot of money being made with very, very small, I'm not going to call these Me Too drugs, but really minor, incremental advantages. So who is in charge of this process? Because here we have government and we have industry, but who's going to bring these forces together here? Because really, there might be different objectives here that people have.
Well, we have a firm up here that could do this, actually.
And that's one of the issues that I have. I think it's a
you're right.
fundamental issue. Who's driving the car here?
And that's always been an issue, and every time that it's come up nationally, we have had, actually, those of you will recall, maybe you won't recall, President Nixon, when he actually released his epistle in 1971, said we will cure cancer in 10 years, a decade. Well, every cancer investigator after that said we'll never set a goal for anything because we'll be held accountable for it. And we had a director recently, not that long ago, who said, well, let's reduce suffering and death from cancer by 2015. And he was pretty much, you know, beaten up in the town square. So to say that anybody could ever be in charge, whereas Alzheimer's has just done this. I mean, they've just set a goal for themselves. Other diseases have set goals for themselves. And that sort of brings people, if not putting somebody in charge, at least it brings them to focus on what an outcome could be. So it's very interesting to think about, is there a way that one could put together a system that is overseen potentially by somebody maybe not in existence today that might include the various members of this group up here. And this came up in 1998. We had a March on Washington. Some of you were there, many of you were there. And one of the recommendations was that we do just that. That it's essentially you set up an oversight group from the agencies that actually are engaged in cancer, pharma, the other players in this space to formulate national strategies. And that never went anywhere because I don't know why, because I think people didn't want to deal with it. They keep coming back to the fact it's too complicated. I don't think it's that complicated anymore. And I think you're absolutely right, Rick. To get a system in place where we have these kind of collaborations and you have the incentives developed the way you need, I think you need some kind of a coordinated effort. And
well, wasn't that in part of the premise for Reagan-Udall, and that
yes.
has been extremely difficult to
yes.
get started.
Yes. So, David, I want to come back to you for a second because just briefly, how would you change this whole paradigm for molecular diagnostics? What action
There has to be a reward system That's true for team medicine also. Industry, by the way, has figured that out. Academia has not, industry has. So there has to be a reward system. So what is that reward system? Either Medicare changes policies, either there's an accelerated approval for molecular diagnostics equivalent that would be associated with both carrot and stick, because you have the perverse situation at the moment that companies can spend years developing these high levels of evidence I talked about, and as has been exemplified by the recent vemurafenib and crizotinib, you have diagnostic companies that worked in good faith with the FDA CDRH, got agents, diagnostic-associated tests, got them approved, and basically every major medical center in the United States is developing their own assays and selling them independently. So there's no business model for that. You are not rewarded, rather you are just displaced. And so there's a problem there. So if you ask me, there are a number of issues involved, but one thing one has to do is reward innovation, reward creativity, reward something that actually contributes to changing medicine. I spent 2 years in a cancer effectiveness, Scott Ramsey, University of Washington, CancerGen, looking at all the current biomarkers in the cancer space, looking for any biomarkers that would potentially, that are currently used or under development, that could actually influence the practice of medicine enough to be considered to be worthy of doing health economic studies in phase 3 trials. And I will tell you, you want to be depressed, that's an area to be depressed. So we need new generations of agents at a higher level of performance. There's no stimulus to do that currently. We need policy changes that will both protect test developers, reward them. That creates business models. That will lead to investment. Once that is shown to be associated with competitive advantage in drug development, then the drug industry will begin to invest in this area.
So who's going to take the lead in all this? Who's
Well, this is a country, I'm very pessimistic in this country for some panel to lead this. It's not going to happen. Culturally, it doesn't happen.
You're
However,
killing me here. Let's do
somebody
something
shows
about
you a competitive advantage to associated with a particular behavior, and then you could not develop specific kinase inhibitors until someone did.
But we just did that. We just had a drug approved, quite a significant advance for melanoma with a test that actually, and these two are now hand in glove. You couldn't have approved the drug without the test. I think it was extraordinarily innovative.
Yeah, but as I'm saying to you, the
economics
of the
device maker going to make any money here?
The test developer's not going to make any money.
Right. That's a problem. So
yeah, that's
I think
a major problem if you're the test
so
developer.
So is it a pharma problem?
Yeah, it's a major problem.
A
former test developer.
So is it a pharma problem if in fact, does pharma have to get in the diagnostics business here?
Well, I think if you look forward, you're looking forward into the greater and greater realm of personalized medicine. You're getting more and more yes, they're getting more and more integrated.
Yes.
The combination of diagnostics, the therapy, and the monitoring are coming together. So yes, it'll be a more integrated system in the future. We will be, or we'll be partnering, just as we are in a lot of the research models moving forward in the system. So the answer is yes. That's what personalized medicine means. You know that. That drives the complexity of the system. That drives challenges for FDA in the approval process.
But
so
maybe there's an interim step here where there's an acquisition strategy for these smaller companies, and then ultimately
yeah,
over
but
time,
be careful with that. Here's one of the things. Pharma.
I'm staying out of that business. So
Okay. And we were talking about this earlier. Last year we invested. We spent just the members of pharma spent $58 billion in research and development. Now, that's just last year. That's about level with the year before, which ain't bad in a really difficult economic environment. But when we look downstream, or upstream, I guess, if we call it upstream, we see about 25% of the venture capital leaving the small biotech, the device field, every year for the last 3 years. We can't replace that.
No.
We have to have an environment that, that brings more venture capital into that part of the system if we're to sustain our part of the system. We can't do the whole thing.
So David, going back to if you go back to the Sematech era, when in fact that industry came together, and Congress actually, we were losing
Sorry, I
that
was in
industry
that
to
at that
Japan.
time. Yep.
We were losing it completely to Japan. And Congress actually stepped in and said, we need to do something about this. And so they actually brought these, these developers together and actually created some legislation to enable that business model. Why couldn't they do that here?
I think it's ripe for doing. It's why I co-chair the Cancer Steering Committee, as you and I did together for years, for the NIH Foundation. I think that the competitive advantage in drug development is no longer in molecule creation. It's in the intelligent application of molecules. And so the industry, which is focused almost entirely, I mean, discovery has disappeared many, many years ago from the industry, true discovery. It's really a molecule creation research, right? And so the efficient development of therapeutics requires the parallel to the intelligent development of targeted agents, which is the intelligent and informed characterization of relevant patient contexts, which is what Rick struggles with in his life. So the competitive advantage is at that interface. That's where there's no business model, but that's where you win. So the issue is, at what point does pre-competitive end and competitive start? And that's a bit of a gray area that's worth discussion, but absolutely worth working on.
Yeah, I would just say, if you're going to use the Sematech example, let's use what we learned about the Sematech model as a small participant in it at the time. There were some really great wastes in that model that we should learn from.
Yeah.
So a better model and more relevant model is the SNP consortium,
Right.
which delivered 10x the number of SNPs that was supposed to in a shorter period of time for less money. And basically what we need is a war on biological characterization of tumors to get back to where Rick started. We need to get past 1850, recharacterize all human malignancy in the context of the new biology, and then let the drug developers add all of that biology, and I think you're going to see a new time.
So I want to get to Ira, because we've been trying to impress you, Ira, with,
Would you agree?
so we're trying to convince you to actually, reimburse for these very advanced technologies that we're creating. And I noted that at least I asked people what questions they thought would be important, and somebody asked, sort of put a question in and said, who's really going to pay for innovation? It's an interesting question, isn't it? Because if, in fact, what I laid out in terms of the numbers of cancer cases we're going to be looking at and the amount of dollars that's going to be required for care, and the issue that someone in this previous panel kind of mentioned in terms of, are we going to have to deal with, what's a year of life really worth if you're a cancer patient, or what's any other patient, I guess. But so tell us what you think needs to be done to convince you, a payer, to reimburse for these advanced technologies. What do you have to see from your standpoint, from an evidence standpoint? What is it that will make you join our team and actually say, yes, advanced technologies for cancer all the way? Or are you already there and we don't have to convince you?
No, I think you're making this assumption that's not necessarily true, that we make decisions about what we'll cover and what will not cover. That's not true.
Yeah,
That's disappointing,
yes.
actually.
You can explain that. You can explain that.
Yeah, I'll explain that. It would be a brave new world if we did have that chance to do those things, but we don't. Rick approves the drug, we cover it, but under certain conditions.
Exactly.
But the issue that I have is when we have these joint approvals, the co-diagnostic with it, we clearly state in the indication by an FDA-approved test. So are you saying that people are not using these tests? And should, well, if they're not, okay, should the reimbursement be contingent upon that diagnostic being used? Because here again, we don't know what the performance characteristics of some of these other tests are. They might not be identifying the appropriate patient population.
Yeah, for some of the newer agents that have come out with companion diagnostic tests, we will not pay for the drug unless we have evidence that the test was done.
Because here again, we've been quite explicit in the indication statement, by an FDA-approved test,
Right.
period. Okay, in the drug indication for both of these examples.
So that
you used.
presumes then that he would pay for it.
I would hope so, yes.
Yes.
That test
Yes.
is selecting, it was correlated with the clinical trial outcome data. Here again, you might say you're measuring ELK by some test that was developed by a university. I have no idea what you're doing. It hasn't been submitted. You might be missing some of the population that was included in the trial. You might be including others that might
Right.
benefit from the test. This whole area is not a trivial issue as we develop more and more of these tests. And I think it was brought out by one of the ODAC meetings that we had for a CML drug, where if you identified a population of patients that was supposed to respond to this chemotherapy drug, you could be denying them a tyrosine kinase, such as imatinib or dasatinib or nilotinib, which had more efficacy in the general population. So, you know, you could be doing harm to patients by using these unapproved tests here and by denying people.
We probably are doing harm.
Yeah,
So,
I think
I'm sorry, Ira,
to
let's...
get back to the original question, I think you laid it out nicely for me to say that if we're on the team, I need my team to block for me better, because I need regulatory and legislation reform.
Yeah.
I don't want to have to deal with 30 different companion diagnostic tests, each of varying levels of quality and efficacy. If practitioners are going to make decisions about treating patients on crappy tests, then who's going to lose? It's going to be the patient.
Do you reimburse for CLIA-approved tests versus FDA-approved tests?
Let me say that with a qualified yes,
Okay.
but there may be exceptions to that.
But I think that is an issue, isn't it? Because it's
Yeah.
going to explode now with lots and lots and lots of academic laboratories setting up their own CLIA laboratories. And that's a problem, because it's a different level of evidence than you have with
And
FDA.
remember, CLIA certifies the lab, not the
the
test.
test.
Exactly, yeah.
Right, you're certifying that it's going to be redone.
Yeah.
I mean, but Kraft certifies the test and its proficiency testing. You're talking about crappy tests, and you're imputing a whole industry. They're not crappy at all. They're far more advanced than some of the IBD.
I don't think anybody's saying, well, somebody might have
Let
said the
me
crappy test,
change,
but
I apologize. Let me change that from
Yeah.
crappy to highly variable.
there you go.
How's that?
Right, yeah.
If you're a patient, you don't, well, if you're a patient, you don't want highly variable testing, do you?
If you look at how CAP creates proficiency testing in anatomical pathology and what is required to show, for example, in the FISH testing of what mutations may be relevant for ULK versus what's in the FDA-approved test, which is not adequate, then you really need to revise your thinking here.
So let's assume actually that you can attack him or me or someone else later. Getting back to our point of the issue of reimbursement, and it's used now. You know, we look at it all the time to say that it's going to stop innovation, and I would think that it's just the opposite. That we could actually use this. I mean, our advanced technology should in fact really enable innovation. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, because you're talking about data libraries. Your ultimate data library is your data repository of the results of patients who have granular information about them recorded at the time of their therapy and what happens to them in continuity over time.
Yeah, so I think that's a myth that just needs to be, you know, exploded, because I think that every time I see that we bring a really innovative test and an associated drug to FDA that works, it gets approved, and it gets approved in incredibly quick time. So I think that as we become more innovative, I think we're doing better and better, and I think you will see, if we have the time horizons, that this is really going to improve the value proposition for advanced technologies.
I understand what I think we said earlier, and you know, just very quickly where Mark McClellan was going through it at a very high rate of speed.
He was actually slow today.
One of the things that you know, we were very careful to negotiate with the FDA was an additional 2 months. I mean, you may have heard that, as
Yes.
Mark went through that. An additional 2 months because while the total time taken is important, the clarity, the certainty, and the finality of the decision is even more important. So we're trading time for certainty.
Right.
So I just want to make sure, nobody leaves this room standing up saying, we think the process ought to be shorter, and oh yeah, by the way, the technical agreement we negotiated extends it. We're willing to trade off the 2 months to make sure that they've got enough time to give us a clear and, as you say, clear and final answer.
So Marcia's giving me the evil eye up here, so I know we have to wrap. So I'm gonna give you each 1 minute, actually, that's all you have, don't expound, to give us one thing that you would do if you had all the resources in the world and you actually, if we had Rick's system and you were controlling the way the world was going to operate in terms of creating an innovative path forward where we actually do more and more and conquer this disease eventually, in your definition of conquer. I'm going to start. One thing I would do, I'd start back in discovery, and I would build a national biorepository with standards so that we have standards for our biospecimens collections, and I would ask the FDA, or the NIH rather, if NIH is going to give out grants to people that they standardize their biospecimens, and we actually create those biospecimen standards, which are already created. Not a lot to ask people that take government money to at least operate with standards. Not a big deal. We ask them to take care of their animals with standards, but we don't ask them to take care of patient samples, which is very, very sad. And I would say the same thing for technology standards if you're going to actually be in the diagnostics business. So, Rick, what's one thing you would do?
I want to get back to the leadership issues, because here again, I think we have a system where we have a private system and a government system, and we really need to have a coordinated effort if we are really going to make progress. We're spending, from a societal perspective, a huge amount of money, a huge amount of resources, a huge amount of patient resources, and we have to have a coordinated system of how we're going to be tackling all of these problems. And it doesn't necessarily have to be cancer in general. Even if we took disease by disease and focused exactly where we wanted to go with a disease.
Different system than we have, but one that could actually be, could be created. David, what's one thing you would do?
I would create a reward system that would be linked regulatory and reimbursement for highly predictive clinical tests believed to change positively the practice of medicine. And that would all be related, the reward would be related to the creation of levels of clinical evidence, not analytic validity, that's assumed. Levels of clinical evidence and clinical utility, which starts to get into the application side.
Great.
That's what I would do if you asked me for one.
All right. You could run for office on that. So, all right.
I think what we really need is to be able to have the societal debate about what are we going to pay for and what are we not going to pay for. Because until we have that, we're not going to be able to do what everybody else here wants to do because there's not going to be the resources.
Agreed.
Once that debate happens, then there can be a great doctor-patient discussion about what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, how are we going to work for each other.
Who convenes that debate?
I actually think it has to be started at the government public space. I think the private payers will innovate on benefit designs and payment methodologies, but the government has to lead from a policy perspective in this area.
Agreed. John, what would you do?
I agree with what Ira just said, and that is that if we don't the biggest thing we could do is fundamentally change the way Medicare rewards innovation for patients. And until that's done, the private sector can't follow.
I agree with you. Yes, Ken.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of faith that if we have innovation, the people on my left will figure out how to pay for it and have access to patients who so desperately need it. My main thing, Ann, is I think we're in a huge crisis in this country in terms of funding new discovery. And I honestly think it's not appreciated on a national election level, et cetera. Generations of researchers are going to be lost. And if you want to know how to limit innovation, it's by not fostering, at a time of unprecedented opportunity, the identification of new targets, and model systems of the tumor and the microenvironment that will, in fact, do two things. Predict for success, so a biomarker or a clinical trial, so can inform clinical trials, but even more important, what I call successful failures, but will stop the development of targets or targeted therapies that are not going to work, or combinations that are directly antagonistic will never make it to patients. So I would, honestly, if I could do one thing, I would really up the ante and on funding of fundamental basic research.
Innovation is tough to get funded. I mean, it really is. You heard from John Mendelsohn this morning. The first grant he ever submitted to the NIH was not funded. The same thing would be true of Denny Slayman for HER2. I think Brian Drucker would tell me the same thing. So innovation is, we don't have a culture within the NIH that's actually terribly accepting of innovation. I think it's better than it was, but we have a long way to go. So I want to thank our panel. We've put them on the spot. They've done a great job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.